On October 14, 1943, something impossible happened in a place designed for absolute control and total death. Deep in the forests of occupied Poland, in a camp the Nazis called Sobibor, 300 prisoners did what the Third Reich believed could never be done. They killed their guards, they set fire to the barracks, and they ran. Not a handful of desperate souls sneaking through the wire, but a coordinated mass uprising that shattered the machinery of genocide, if only for one afternoon. This was not a story of survival by luck or chance. This was a rebellion, meticulously planned, executed with surgical precision, and then systematically erased from history by the very regime it humiliated. What you are about to hear is the secret the Nazis tried to bury in the ashes, the story that even the Allies barely acknowledged, and the truth that Hollywood has only whispered about. This is Sobibor. To understand why this rebellion mattered, you need to understand what Sobibor was. It was not a labor camp, it was not a prison. Sobibor was a factory, and its only product was death. Built in early 1942 as part of Operation Reinhard, the Nazi plan to exterminate the Jews of Poland, Sobibor existed for one reason: to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, and leave no trace behind. The camp sat in a remote, swampy forest near the Bug River, far from towns, far from roads, far from witnesses. Trains would arrive carrying Jews from across Europe, packed into cattle cars, suffocating and terrified. The moment the doors opened, the sorting began. A handful were chosen to work, to clean the gas chambers, to sort the clothes of the dead, to keep the machine running. Everyone else walked a path the Nazis called the Road to Heaven, a narrow lane flanked by barbed wire and pine branches, leading directly to the gas chambers disguised as showers. Within hours of arrival, they were dead. Their bodies were burned. Their belongings were shipped to Germany, and the camp waited for the next train. By the autumn of 1943, Sobibor had murdered roughly 250,000 people. But the camp had a problem. The prisoners who worked there, the ones who cleaned the gas chambers and buried the bodies, knew too much. They had seen the entire process. They understood the system. And worse, from the Nazi perspective, they were still alive. These prisoners lived in a state of controlled terror, knowing that their usefulness had an expiration date. At any moment, they could be marched to the gas chambers themselves, replaced by a fresh group from the next transport. They had nothing to lose, and they knew it. The Nazis believed fear would paralyze them. They were wrong. Among the prisoners were men and women who had already lost everything. Their families were dead. Their homes were gone. Their futures had been stolen. But they still had rage, and they still had will. In the summer of 1943, two men began to channel that rage into something the Nazis never anticipated. Leon Feldhendler was a Polish Jew, a former leader in his community, a man who had survived by working in the camp's administrative offices. Alexander Pechersky was a Soviet officer, a Jew captured on the Eastern Front and sent to Sobibor in late September of 1943. Pechersky was a soldier, trained in tactics and command. Feldhendler was a planner, someone who understood the camp's routines and weaknesses. Together, they began to ask a question that should have been unthinkable. What if we fought back? The idea was insane. The camp was surrounded by minefields and barbed wire. The guards were armed with rifles and machine guns. Watchtowers loomed over every corner. Escape seemed mathematically impossible. But Pechersky and Feldhendler realized something crucial. The Nazis were arrogant. They believed their prisoners were broken, passive, too afraid to resist. That arrogance was a weapon, and the prisoners could use it. If they could kill the guards quietly, one by one, and seize control of the armory before the alarm was raised, they might have a window. A small window, maybe only minutes, but enough to open the gates and run. The plan required perfect timing, absolute silence, and a willingness to die trying. They had all three. Over the next 2 weeks, Pechersky and Feldhendler recruited a core group of conspirators. They spread the word carefully in whispers, only to those they trusted. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. On the afternoon of October 14th, during the camp's quietest hours, they would lure SS officers and guards into workshops and barracks, one at a time, under the pretense of fittings for new boots or coats. Once inside, They would be killed with axes, knives, and anything else the prisoners could hide. After the guards were dead, the prisoners would steal their weapons, cut the phone lines, and make a run for the forest. If it worked, hundreds might escape. If it failed, everyone would die. But they were going to die anyway. At least this way they would die fighting. The day of October 14th began like any other day in Sobibor. The sun rose over the pine trees. The guards conducted roll call. Prisoners shuffled to their work assignments, moving through the camp with the practiced numbness of people who had learned to stop hoping. But beneath that surface of routine obedience, something was already in motion. Pechersky and Feldhendler had finalized the list. 11 SS officers and guards would be targeted, lured into specific locations throughout the camp between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. Each kill had to be silent, swift, and invisible to the watchtowers. The weapons were hidden. Axes in the carpentry shop, knives wrapped in cloth, hammers stashed under workbenches. The conspirators knew their roles. There would be no second chance, no room for hesitation. If even one guard escaped and sounded the alarm, the rebellion would collapse into a massacre. The camp itself was a masterpiece of Nazi efficiency and cruelty. Sobibor was divided into 3 sections, separated by barbed wire and guarded pathways. Camp 1 held the administrative buildings, the barracks for the workers, and the workshops where prisoners repaired uniforms and built furniture for the SS. Camp 2 was the processing area, where new arrivals were stripped, their hair was cut, and their belongings were sorted. Camp 3 was death. It contained the gas chambers, the burial pits, and later the massive ovens used to burn the bodies. Most of the prisoners never saw Camp 3. Only a small group, called the Sonderkommando, worked there, and they were kept isolated, knowing they were witnesses the Nazis would eventually eliminate. The entire camp was surrounded by a 3-meter-high barbed wire fence, beyond which lay minefields extending 50 meters in every direction. Watchtowers stood at each corner, manned by armed Ukrainian guards who had been recruited and trained by the Germans. Escape was considered impossible. But Pechersky understood something the Nazis did not. The camp's isolation was also its weakness. Sobibor was small, with fewer than 20 SS officers and around 100 Ukrainian auxiliaries. The staff rotated in predictable patterns. The officers moved through the camp with arrogance, unarmed in certain areas, believing their authority alone was enough to control the prisoners. That arrogance created blind spots. The workshops, for example, were places where SS men came to have uniforms tailored or boots repaired. They entered alone, without backup, without suspicion. Those moments of isolation were exactly what Pechersky needed. If the prisoners could kill the officers in those private spaces, quietly and quickly, they could accumulate weapons and create chaos before anyone realized what was happening. The plan also depended on timing. The rebellion was scheduled for mid-afternoon because that was when the camp was at its quietest. The morning roll calls were finished. The major work details were underway. The guards were relaxed, some even napping in their barracks. The SS officers would be moving between offices, checking on workshops, conducting inspections. That window between 3 and 4 o'clock was when the camp's defenses were at their thinnest. Pechersky knew they would never get a better opportunity. He also knew that once the killing started, they would have no more than 15 to 20 minutes before the alarm was raised and the machine guns in the watchtowers opened fire. In that narrow slice of time, they had to kill the guards, cut the phone lines, open the gates, and get as many people into the forest as possible. As the afternoon approached, the tension became unbearable. Prisoners assigned to the workshops sharpened their hidden blades one last time. Those tasked with guarding the doors rehearsed their signals in their minds. Pechersky moved through the camp, making brief eye contact with his co-conspirators, giving silent nods of confirmation. Everyone understood the stakes. There would be no warning, no announcement. When the first SS officer walked into the tailor shop at 3 o'clock that afternoon, the rebellion would begin, and there would be no turning back. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, SS Oberscharführer Josef Vallaster walked into the tailor shop. He had come for a fitting, expecting a new uniform jacket that one of the prisoners had been altering for him. He entered alone, as he always did, his rifle left casually outside. The tailors greeted him with the usual submissive nods, gesturing for him to step into the back room where the fitting would take place. Vallister followed without hesitation. He had done this dozens of times before, but this time, the moment he crossed the threshold, two prisoners moved behind him. One struck him in the head with an axe, the other finished the job with a knife. Vallister collapsed without a sound. His body was dragged behind a pile of fabric, his uniform stripped, his pistol taken. The first kill was complete. The rebellion had begun. Minutes later, SS Scharführer Rudolf Beckmann entered the shoemaker's workshop. He wanted a pair of boots repaired and had been told they were ready for inspection. The shoemaker, a prisoner named Yakov Biskubich, smiled and invited him in. Beckmann never saw the blade. He was killed with the same cold efficiency as Vallister, his body hidden beneath a workbench, his weapons passed to the waiting conspirators. One by one, over the next 30 minutes, SS officers were lured into workshops, storage rooms, and barracks. Each kill followed the same pattern: an invitation, a moment of trust, and then sudden, brutal violence. The prisoners moved with a precision born from desperation. They could not afford mistakes. Every dead guard brought them one step closer to freedom, but also one step closer to discovery. The tension was suffocating. By 3:30, 9 SS officers and 2 Ukrainian guards were dead. Their bodies were hidden throughout the camp, their weapons distributed to the prisoners who had trained for this moment. Pechersky's plan was working, but the clock was ticking. The camp's daily routine was beginning to shift. Guards who had not yet been targeted were starting to notice the unusual quiet. Some of the SS officers who were supposed to report back to the main office had not appeared. Suspicion was creeping in. Pechersky knew they were running out of time. He gave the signal. The next phase of the plan would begin immediately. A group of prisoners moved toward the camp's armory, a small building near the main gate where extra rifles and ammunition were stored. If they could seize it, they would have the firepower to hold off the watchtowers long enough for the mass escape to begin. But something went wrong. As the prisoners approached the armory, one of the Ukrainian guards who had not been part of the target list spotted them. He saw the stolen SS uniforms, the weapons in their hands, and immediately understood what was happening. He shouted an alarm and ran toward the nearest watchtower. The sound of his voice shattered the silence. The element of surprise was gone. Pechersky realized instantly that the careful, quiet phase of the rebellion was over. There was no more time for subtlety. He shouted the prearranged signal in Russian and Yiddish, a single word that every prisoner in the camp had been waiting to hear. Run. Chaos erupted. Prisoners poured out of the barracks, the workshops, the sorting sheds. Some grabbed axes, shovels, or stolen rifles. Others ran with nothing but their hands. The watchtowers opened fire. Machine gun bullets tore through the crowd, cutting down prisoners as they sprinted toward the fences. Some veered toward the main gate, trying to overwhelm the guards stationed there. Others ran directly at the barbed wire, throwing their bodies against it, trying to climb over or tunnel under. The minefields beyond the fences began to explode. The sound was deafening, a roar of gunfire, screaming, and detonations that echoed across the forest. The Sobibor death machine, so carefully designed for control and extermination, was tearing itself apart. The main gate became a killing ground. A group of prisoners armed with stolen rifles rushed the entrance, firing at the Ukrainian guards who scrambled to lock it down. Bullets flew in both directions. Some prisoners fell instantly, their bodies crumpling in the dirt. Others pushed forward, using the chaos as cover, throwing themselves at the gate with a fury that overwhelmed the guards. The gate gave way. For the first time since Sobibor had opened, the primary exit was breached. Dozens of prisoners flooded through, running toward the tree line as the watchtowers swiveled their machine guns to track them. Tracer rounds lit up the afternoon sky. The forest just 50 meters away seemed impossibly distant. Every step was a gamble. Every second, another explosion from the minefields, another scream, another life extinguished. Inside the camp, Pechersky was trying to maintain some semblance of order, but the plan had already fractured. The original strategy had been to move in organized groups, each with a leader, cutting through the fences at predetermined weak points. But the premature alarm had shattered that coordination. Now it was pure survival. Prisoners ran in every direction, some following Pechersky's shouted commands, others simply fleeing toward any gap they could find. The barbed wire fences became choke points. Men and women threw their coats over the wire and climbed, slicing their hands and legs on the barbs, ignoring the pain. Some made it over. Others were shot mid-climb, their bodies hanging limply on the wire. The Ukrainian guards, initially caught off guard, were now regrouping, firing indiscriminately into the mass of fleeing prisoners. The minefields were the next nightmare. The Nazis had planted them in irregular patterns, specifically to prevent escapes. And now they were doing exactly what they were designed to do. Prisoners who made it past the fences ran headlong into the hidden explosives. The detonations came in rapid succession, geysers of dirt and smoke erupting across the field. Some prisoners tried to follow the footsteps of those ahead, hoping to find a safe path. Others simply ran blind, praying they would be lucky. Many were not. The explosions carved gaps in the fleeing crowd, leaving craters filled with the dead and dying. But for every prisoner killed by the mines, 2 more made it through. The sheer number of people running overwhelmed the defenses. The minefields could not stop them all. Pechersky himself led a group of about 60 prisoners toward the northeastern section of the fence, an area he had identified as having fewer watchtower sightlines. They cut through the wire with stolen tools and pliers, working frantically as bullets zipped overhead. Once through, Pechersky ordered everyone to spread out and run in zigzag patterns to make themselves harder targets. He knew the minefields were there, but he also knew hesitation was death. They ran. Explosions erupted around them. Pechersky felt the concussive blast of a mine detonating just meters to his left, the shockwave nearly knocking him off his feet. He kept running. Others in his group were not as fortunate. He heard screams behind him but did not look back. There was no time. The forest was ahead, dark and dense, offering the only hope of cover. Within 20 minutes of the alarm being raised, roughly 300 prisoners had attempted to escape. Half were killed immediately, cut down by machine gun fire, blown apart by mines, or shot while tangled in the wire. But the other half, around 150 people, made it into the forest. They disappeared into the trees, scattering in all directions, running deeper into the wilderness as the sounds of gunfire and explosions faded behind them. For the first time in nearly 2 years of operation, Sobibor had lost control. The impossible had happened. The death factory had been broken. Back inside Sobibor, the camp descended into chaos. The remaining SS officers and Ukrainian guards moved through the barracks and workshops, executing any prisoner who had not escaped. There was no trial, no interrogation, just immediate death. The Nazis understood what had happened, and they were eliminating witnesses. Bodies were dragged into piles. The fires that the prisoners had set during the revolt still burned, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. The camp's commandant, SS Hauptsturmführer Franz Reichleitner, was not present during the uprising. He had been away on leave, a stroke of luck for the rebels. But his deputy, SS Oberscharführer Karl Frenzel, took control and immediately ordered a manhunt. Every available German soldier and Ukrainian auxiliary in the region was mobilized. Dogs were brought in. The forest surrounding Sobibor became a hunting ground. The escapees had no map, no compass, and no plan beyond survival. Most had never been in a forest before. They were tailors, shopkeepers, teachers, people who had lived in cities and towns before the war. Now they were fugitives, stumbling through thick underbrush, wading through swamps and hiding in ditches. The forest was vast, stretching for miles in every direction, but it was also hostile. The ground was wet and treacherous. The cold October air bit at their skin. Many had no shoes, having lost them in the chaos of the escape. They wrapped their feet in cloth torn from their uniforms and kept moving. Stopping meant death. The sound of barking dogs echoed through the trees, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there, reminding them they were being hunted. Pechersky's group moved northeast, deeper into the wilderness, avoiding roads and villages. He knew that the local Polish population was unpredictable. Some Poles would help Jews in hiding, offering food or shelter. Others would turn them into the Nazis for a reward, or simply out of anti-Semitism. Trust was a luxury they could not afford. Pechersky led his group through the densest parts of the forest, moving only at night, hiding during the day in thickets and abandoned barns. They foraged for food, eating raw potatoes stolen from fields, drinking from streams. Hunger and exhaustion were constant companions. Several members of the group collapsed and could not continue. Pechersky made the agonizing decision to leave them behind. There was no choice. The group could not slow down. The hunters were too close. Over the next several days, the Nazi manhunt intensified. German patrols combed the forest, setting up checkpoints on every road. Local collaborators were offered bounties for information. Many escapees were captured and executed on the spot. Others were betrayed by locals and handed over to the authorities. Some were killed by Polish partisans who saw them as competition for scarce resources or simply did not want Jews in their territory. The forest, which had seemed like salvation, became another gauntlet. Of the 150 prisoners who made it out of Sobibor, fewer than 60 survived the first week. The rest were hunted down, captured, or died from exposure and starvation. But those who survived kept moving. Pechersky eventually made contact with Soviet partisans operating in the region. His military experience and leadership earned him a place in their ranks, and he continued to fight the Nazis until the Red Army liberated the area in 1944. Other survivors found refuge with sympathetic Polish families, hiding in attics and cellars until the war ended. A handful made it all the way to Soviet-held territory, walking for weeks through enemy lines. Each survivor carried the weight of what they had witnessed, the memory of those who did not make it, and the knowledge that they had done the impossible. They had fought back, they had escaped, and they had survived. The Nazi response to the Sobibor uprising was swift and ruthless, but it also revealed something the Reich desperately wanted to hide: fear. The rebellion had shattered the illusion of absolute control. For the first time, the world saw that prisoners in a death camp could organize, fight back, and escape. This was not the narrative the Nazis wanted. Their entire system of terror depended on the belief that resistance was futile, that the machinery of extermination was unstoppable. Sobibor proved otherwise. Within days of the revolt, Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the final solution, issued orders that stunned even his own officers. Sobibor was to be dismantled completely, not repaired, not reinforced, erased. The demolition began in late October, just 2 weeks after the uprising. SS units returned to the camp with explosives and heavy machinery. The gas chambers were blown apart. The barracks were burned to the ground. The mass graves containing the bodies of over 250,000 murdered Jews were exhumed. The Nazis forced the remaining prisoners, those who had not escaped or been executed, to dig up the corpses and burn them on massive pyres. The ashes were scattered. The ground was ploughed and planted with trees to disguise the site as a farm. By the end of November 1943, Sobibor no longer existed. The Nazis wanted to erase not just the camp, but the very memory of what had happened there. If the world could not see the evidence, the rebellion could be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. The truth could be buried along with the ashes. But the survivors would not let the story die. Those who made it through the forest and lived to see liberation carried the memory of October 14th with them. Alexander Pechersky survived the war, fighting with Soviet partisans until the Red Army pushed the Germans back. After the war, he returned to the Soviet Union, where he expected to be celebrated as a hero. Instead, he was met with suspicion. Stalin's government viewed Jewish survivors with paranoia, questioning how they had survived when so many others had not. Pechersky was interrogated, accused of collaboration, and forbidden from speaking publicly about Sobibor. His story, like those of many Soviet Jewish survivors, was suppressed. The Soviet Union did not want to acknowledge the specific targeting of Jews by the Nazis. They preferred the narrative of general Soviet suffering. Pechersky's heroism was buried under state censorship. In the West, the story of Sobibor fared little better. The camp had been destroyed so thoroughly that many historians initially doubted its existence. There were no photographs, no extensive records, only the testimonies of a few survivors scattered across different countries. The Nuremberg trials focused on the major camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka, where the evidence was overwhelming. Sobibor, by comparison, was a footnote. The few survivors who made it to Israel, the United States, or other Allied nations tried to tell their stories. but they were often met with disbelief or indifference. The world was exhausted by tales of Nazi atrocities. People wanted to move on, to rebuild, to forget. The survivors found themselves shouting into a void. For decades, Sobibor remained a secret, known only to a small circle of historians and Holocaust researchers. Leon Feldhendler, the co-leader of the revolt, survived the war but was murdered in Poland in 1945, likely by anti-Semitic locals who resented his return. Pechersky lived until 1990, but his story was only widely recognized in the final years of his life, after the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed previously suppressed histories to emerge. The world had forgotten Sobibor, just as the Nazis had intended. But the truth, as it always does, refused to stay buried forever. The full story of Sobibor began to emerge in the late 1960s, when a Dutch journalist named Jules Schelvis, himself a survivor of the camp, published one of the first comprehensive accounts of what had happened there. Schelvis had been deported to Sobibor in June 1943, but was separated from his family upon arrival and sent to a labor camp instead of the gas chambers. He survived the war and spent decades searching for other survivors, piecing together testimonies and hunting for evidence. His work, combined with that of other researchers, slowly reconstructed the timeline of the revolt. They tracked down survivors in Israel, the Soviet Union, the United States, and South America. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle. What emerged was a picture of coordinated resistance on a scale that had never been documented before. The turning point in public awareness came in 1987, when a film called Escape from Sobibor was released, directed by Jack Gold and starring Alan Arkin as Pechersky. The film was based on survivor testimonies and historical research, and it brought the story to a mainstream audience for the first time. Millions of people around the world watched as the screen depicted the planning, the killings, the escape, and the desperate run through the minefields. The film did not glorify the violence. It showed the revolt for what it was, a brutal, desperate act of survival by people who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. For many viewers, it was the first time they had heard of Sobibor at all. The film sparked renewed interest in the camp and the uprising, leading to more research, more survivor interviews, and eventually more books and documentaries. But even with growing awareness, the physical site of Sobibor remained hidden. The Nazis had done their job well. The camp had been ploughed under, the trees had grown, and the land had been returned to farmland. For decades, the exact location of the gas chambers and mass graves was uncertain. Archaeologists knew the general area, but the precise layout of the camp was lost. That changed in 2014, when a team of researchers using ground-penetrating radar and other advanced technology finally located the remains of the camp's infrastructure. They found the foundations of the gas chambers, the outline of the barracks, and evidence of the mass graves. They even discovered personal items, a pendant with a Jewish star, a child's shoe, fragments of bone. The physical evidence confirmed what the survivors had been saying for decades. Sobibor was real. The revolt was real. And the Nazis had tried to erase it all. The archaeological discoveries led to the creation of a memorial and museum at the site in Poland. The museum opened in 2020, 77 years after the revolt. It stands on the exact location where the gas chambers once operated, a stark reminder of the industrialized murder that took place there. The design is deliberately somber, a long pathway lined with the names of known victims, a symbolic representation of the road to heaven that led prisoners to their deaths. At the center of the memorial is a tower, built to represent the watchtowers that once guarded the camp. Visitors can climb it and look out over the forest, the same forest that the escapees ran through in October 1943. The memorial does not shy away from the horror. It forces visitors to confront what happened there. The museum also tells the story of the revolt in detail, using survivor testimonies, photographs, and artifacts recovered from the site. It honors the names of those who led the uprising: Alexander Pechersky, Leon Feldhendler, and the dozens of other prisoners who risked everything to fight back. For the first time, the story of Sobibor is being told in the place where it actually happened. The secret that the Nazis tried to bury has been dragged into the light. and the world is finally listening. The legacy of the Sobibor revolt extends far beyond the physical memorial. It forced historians to reconsider the narrative of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. For decades, the dominant story was one of passive victimhood, of people led quietly to their deaths without fighting back. That narrative was never accurate, but it persisted because it was simpler, easier to digest. Sobibor shattered that myth. The uprising proved that even in the most extreme conditions of terror and control, resistance was possible. It was not common and it was not easy, but it happened. The prisoners of Sobibor were not soldiers. They were ordinary people, civilians with no military training, no weapons, and no hope of outside help. Yet they organized, they planned, and they executed one of the most daring acts of resistance in the entire war. The revolt also highlighted the deliberate suppression of Jewish resistance stories by both the Soviets and the West. In the Soviet Union, the heroism of Pechersky and other Jewish partisans was buried under the broader narrative of Soviet suffering. Stalin's regime refused to acknowledge the Holocaust as a specifically Jewish tragedy, instead framing it as part of the general Nazi assault on Soviet citizens. Jewish survivors who tried to speak out were silenced, investigated, or imprisoned. Pechersky himself was branded a potential traitor and lived under surveillance for years. In the West, the focus on major camps like Auschwitz meant that smaller operations like Sobibor were overlooked. The result was a historical blind spot that lasted for generations. What makes Sobibor even more significant is that it was not the only revolt in the Nazi camp system, but it was the most successful. In August 1943, just 2 months before Sobibor, prisoners at Treblinka also staged an uprising. They set fire to the camp and attempted a mass escape. Roughly 200 prisoners made it out, but most were hunted down and killed within days. Only around 70 survived the war. In October 1944, Jewish Sonderkommando at Auschwitz-Birkenau revolted, blowing up one of the crematoria with smuggled explosives. Nearly all of them were killed in the immediate aftermath. These revolts were acts of extraordinary courage, but Sobibor stands out because of the number of survivors. Of the roughly 300 prisoners who attempted to escape, approximately 50 to 60 lived to see the end of the war. That survival rate, though still devastating, was unheard of in the context of Nazi death camps. The survivors carried the weight of their experience for the rest of their lives. Many struggled with what today would be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress. They had nightmares, survivor's guilt, and the unbearable knowledge that they had lived while so many others had died. Some chose to speak publicly about their experiences, testifying at war crimes trials and giving interviews to historians. Others retreated into silence, unable or unwilling to relive the horror. Thomas Blatt, one of the most vocal survivors, dedicated his life to ensuring the story of Sobibor was told. He wrote books, gave lectures, and returned to the site multiple times. He died in 2015, just 1 year after the archaeological team rediscovered the gas chambers. His final years were spent knowing that the world had finally acknowledged what he and the others had endured. The revolt also had immediate consequences for the Nazi extermination machine. After Sobibor was destroyed, the remaining Operation Reinhard camps, Treblinka and Belzec, were also shut down and dismantled. By the end of 1943, all 3 camps had been erased from the landscape. The Nazis shifted their extermination operations to Auschwitz, which had both labor and killing facilities. The revolts at Sobibor and Treblinka did not stop the Holocaust, but they disrupted it. They forced the Nazis to adapt, to fortify their remaining camps, and to acknowledge that their system was not as invincible as they believed. In the decades following the war, the hunt for justice became another chapter in the Sobibor story. The SS officers and guards who had operated the camp scattered across the globe, many of them escaping to South America, the Middle East, or disappearing into the chaos of post-war Europe. Some changed their identities, obtained false papers, and built new lives hoping the world would forget their crimes. But the survivors did not forget. Organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the Nazi hunters who emerged in the 1960s and 70s tracked down these men one by one. In 1966, 11 former Sobibor SS personnel were put on trial in Hagen, West Germany. The trial lasted for months, with survivors traveling from around the world to testify. They recounted the murders, the gas chambers, and the revolt in excruciating detail. 5 of the defendants were convicted and sentenced to prison, though the sentences were shockingly lenient, ranging from 3 to 8 years. One of the most notorious Sobibor SS officers, Karl Frenzel, was convicted in the Hagen trial, but served only a fraction of his sentence before being released. He lived quietly in Germany until 1982, when he was retried after new evidence emerged. This time, he was sentenced to life in prison, though he was released again in 1996 due to poor health. He died in 1998, having spent most of his post-war life as a free man. His case, like so many others, highlighted the failures of post-war justice. The men who had operated Sobibor, who had murdered hundreds of thousands, largely escaped meaningful punishment. The survivors watched in frustration as their tormentors lived comfortable lives, their crimes minimized or forgotten by a world eager to move on. The most significant legal breakthrough came in 2009 when John Demjanjuk, a former Ukrainian guard at Sobibor, was extradited from the United States to Germany to stand trial. Demjanjuk had been living in Ohio for decades, working as an auto worker, until survivors identified him from old photographs. His trial in Munich became one of the last major Holocaust prosecutions. He was convicted in 2011 of being an accessory to the murder of over 28,000 people at Sobibor. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but died in 2012 before his appeal was heard. The trial was significant not because of the sentence, but because it established a legal precedent. Even low-level guards and functionaries could be held accountable for their participation in the Holocaust. It was a recognition that the machinery of genocide required the complicity of thousands, not just the orders of a few. But justice, such as it was, came too late for most. By the time Demjanjuk was convicted, nearly all of the Sobibor survivors had died. Pechersky was long gone. Feldhendler had been murdered in 1945. Thomas Blatt lived to see the trial, but was already in declining health. The survivors spent their final years knowing that the vast majority of those responsible for Sobibor had never faced a courtroom. The guards who pulled the triggers, the officers who gave the orders, the bureaucrats who organized the transports, most of them lived out their lives in obscurity. The slow pace of justice was itself a kind of erasure, a way of allowing history to slip away before the perpetrators could be held to account. Yet the trials, incomplete as they were, served another purpose. They created a public record. They forced the world to hear the testimonies, to confront the evidence, and to acknowledge what had happened at Sobibor. The courtroom became a stage where the voices of the dead could finally be heard, spoken through the survivors who had witnessed their murders. The trials ensured that even if the Nazis succeeded in destroying the camp, they could not destroy the memory. The story would survive. Today, the story of Sobibor stands as one of the most powerful reminders that resistance, even in the face of overwhelming evil, is possible. The revolt on October 14, 1943, was not a guaranteed success. It was not a clean victory. More than half of those who attempted to escape were killed within hours or days. The survivors endured unimaginable hardship, and many carried the scars of that day for the rest of their lives. But the fact that they tried, the fact that they succeeded even partially, is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The prisoners of Sobibor were not supposed to fight back. They were supposed to die quietly, erased from history along with the evidence of their existence. Instead, they became a symbol of defiance that the Nazis could never fully suppress. The deliberate erasure of Sobibor by the Nazis is itself a critical part of the story. The lengths to which they went to destroy the camp, to burn the bodies, to plant trees over the graves reveal a deep fear. They feared the truth. They feared that if the world knew what had happened at Sobibor, if people understood the scale of the murders and the brutality of the system, it would undermine the legitimacy of the Reich. The revolt amplified that fear. It proved that the so-called master race could be defeated by the very people they considered subhuman. That was intolerable to the Nazi worldview. So they tried to erase it. They dismantled the camp, killed the witnesses and buried the evidence. For decades it seemed like they had succeeded, but they underestimated the power of memory. They underestimated the determination of survivors like Pechersky, Blatt, and Shelvis, who refused to let the story die. These men and women spent the rest of their lives ensuring that Sobibor would not be forgotten. They gave interviews, wrote memoirs, testified at trials, and pressured governments and historians to investigate. Their efforts were often met with indifference or skepticism, but they persisted. And slowly, the story began to emerge. By the 1980s, Sobibor was no longer a secret. By the 2000s, it was being taught in schools, memorialized in films, and studied by scholars. The survivors had won. The truth had survived. The lessons of Sobibor extend beyond the Holocaust. The revolt is a case study in the mechanics of resistance under totalitarian systems. It demonstrates that even in environments designed to crush hope, human beings can organize, plan, and act. The prisoners had no outside support, no weapons, and no training. What they had was desperation, courage, and a shared understanding that death was preferable to continued submission. They turned the camp's own routines and arrogance against it. They exploited the blind spots in the Nazi system and used the oppressors' tools, stolen axes, and knives to strike back. The revolt was not a miracle. It was the result of careful planning, incredible risk-taking, and the willingness to die for a chance at freedom. Sobibor also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about memory and forgetting. Why did it take so long for this story to be told? Why were the testimonies of survivors dismissed or ignored for decades? Part of the answer lies in the political priorities of the post-war world. The Soviet Union suppressed Jewish narratives to fit its own ideological framework. The West, exhausted by war and eager to rebuild, was reluctant to dwell on the darkest chapters of recent history. Survivors were often seen as inconvenient reminders of atrocities that people wanted to forget. The result was a collective amnesia that allowed the story of Sobibor to slip through the cracks. It is only in recent decades, as the last survivors have passed away, that the full weight of their testimony has been recognized. The memorial at Sobibor, opened in 2020, is more than a tribute to the dead. It is an act of defiance in its own right. By building the museum on the exact site of the gas chambers, by naming the victims, by telling the story of the revolt in unflinching detail, the memorial reclaims the space that the Nazis tried to erase. It transforms a place of death into a place of education and remembrance. Visitors who walk through the museum are confronted with the reality of what happened there. They see the photographs, read the testimonies, and stand in the forest where the escapees ran for their lives. The memorial ensures that the story of Sobibor will endure long after the last survivor is gone. The revolt at Sobibor was not the end of the Holocaust. It did not stop the killings. But it proved something that the Nazis desperately wanted the world to believe was impossible, that victims of the final solution could fight back, that they could organize, and that they could win, even if only for a moment. The story of Sobibor is not just about suffering. It is about courage, resistance, and the refusal to be erased. It is a story that the Nazis tried to bury in the ashes, but the survivors refused to let it die. And now, more than 80 years later, the world finally knows the secret of Sobibor. The rebellion happened, the escape succeeded, and the truth survived. That, in the end, is the greatest act of resistance of all.